Tsunamis that obliterate our best defense systems.
The scale of destruction was almost absolute.
Volcanoes that kill millions.
You don't want to get caught in one of these flows because you're simultaneously burnt, suffocated, and pummeled to death.
Earthquakes that expose the planet's inner secrets, and diseases that push humanity towards extinction.
The travel doctor took one look and said, "You have the bubonic plague."
But which catastrophes have had the biggest impact? We're going to reveal the top 10 ultimate natural disasters that have changed the world. A natural disaster. The moment a force of nature collides with humanity, with tragic results. Now, together with some of the world's leading experts, we've put together a list of the 10 most devastating disasters ever.
2, 1.
Disasters are rated by their magnitude, their lasting legacy, death toll, and the economic cost of the damage they caused. First on our list is the deadly 2011 tornado season that meteorologist Karen Kosiba firmly places in the top 10. Spring in Middle America.
We have a tornado on the ground, it's Ashtola, Texas.
A time when a vast swathe of land from Texas to the Canadian prairies is transformed into Tornado Alley.
Don't even stop, just go! Go! Get the hell out of here!
This part of the world is used to twisters, but the 2011 outbreak stands out.
Holy cow!
We could actually hear the house coming apart. The wood, the walls. My wife had to grab a hold of some of the plumbing pipes because she was being sucked towards the stairwell.
Look at that! Destruction!
I've been collecting data on tornadoes for over 7 years now, and I haven't seen anything like the 2011 tornado season.
Weather experts like Karen are only just beginning to piece together how a tornado forms.
We do know the ingredients that are necessary to come together in order to form the storms that spawn tornadoes. In particular, there are 3 ingredients that we need. First of all, we need a very unstable air mass. Also, we need wind shear, so we need a lot of turning of winds with height in the atmosphere. And then thirdly, we need some sort of trigger, some sort of impetus to get these storms started.
In 2011, all 3 factors come together to create the perfect tornado breeding ground. By early April, a massive weather system forms over southeastern USA, spawning an outbreak of twisters.
Only a small percentage of them were violent, but there were a lot of them. Unfortunately, in 2011, the violent tornadoes were impacting larger cities, and that's where we ran into our issues with people being unfortunately killed and injured.
April the 25th, the start of a series of storms that'll generate 343 tornadoes in less than a week, killing 321 people. It's one of the deadliest outbreaks in US history.
Jumbo outbreak of tornadoes, which is probably the worst kind to get.
On April the 27th, a ferocious tornado batters Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
This is a large, violent tornado coming up on downtown Tuscaloosa. Be in a safe place right now.
Wind speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour leave 65 people dead.
The destruction was, in some cases, total and complete.
After the horrific events of April 2011, the start of May is eerily quiet. Until May the 22nd, a massive tornado takes shape. In its path is Joplin, Missouri.
My daughter came rushing out of her bedroom and said, you know, my friend's mom called. She said, there's a tornado coming. We need to get her home.
Joplin resident Tim Bartow grew up in Tornado Alley. But even he's caught out by the storm's ferocity.
Within a matter of a couple minutes, sirens actually started to go off.
Cover on the ground right here. Right, get the sirens going. Get the sirens going. I'm telling you.
The tornado carves a path through Joplin's southwestern suburbs. With just seconds to spare, Tim Bartow and his family find cover.
As I was going around the corner to go down the basement, the corner of the kitchen was coming apart. You could hear the sound coming. It was like these, you know, people say it was like it sounds like a locomotive, and it sounds like a dozen. There was debris and chunks of mud and sludge and rain and glass and rocks and bricks and everything blowing in through that door and all around us. And it was at that time that I realized the tornado was right on top of us. We could actually hear the house coming apart. And I thought, there's nothing between us and the vortex of this tornado except 1-inch piece of wood that we have in the floor. And of course, the rest of the family, they were crying and they were just hysterical.
I love everyone. I love everyone, man. Yeah, I love you guys.
Intense updrafts near the surface, wafting all different sorts of debris, lifting houses and cars, creating a very dangerous, dark, and volatile environment. Tornadoes really are one of the most devastating forces in nature on the planet.
The carnage caused by a direct hit from an EF5 tornado is all too real for the residents of Joplin, Missouri.
The south side of Joplin's just been leveled. Houses are gone. People are thrown, injured. I know we're going to have casualties. It's like a down floor. It's gone. It's gone.
At that point, I didn't know how bad it was, but I knew we had survived a direct hit.
Unbelievable. Look at the houses.
That's when I got my first look at what had happened.
With winds in excess of 320 kilometers per hour, the energy released is equivalent to that of a 10-ton bomb detonating.
Hello? Hello? Oh, give her, sweetie. Give her, honey.
The house now was gone. The kitchen was totally gone. And there were parts of other people's houses in our kitchen. And one by one, you'd see these piles of rubbles where an arm would poke through or leg would poke through. Most of the family broke down and started to cry.
Leaving 158 people dead, the Joplin tornado is the deadliest since modern records began. And with over $2.8 billion worth of damage, it's also the costliest. The 758 twisters in April are the greatest number ever seen in 1 month. It's for these reasons Karen Kasiba rates the 2011 tornado season as one of the top 10 natural disasters.
Not only do we have a lot of tornadoes, especially in the months of April and May, but we also had tornadoes hitting populated areas. And not just any type of tornado, so the highest possible wind speeds that could be associated with tornadoes. Those factors in particular are what made that season so devastating.
March 2011. A massive earthquake rocks the world on its axis. The epicenter, 65 kilometers off the coast of Japan.
In Japan, we get earth tremors every few weeks. There's amazing earthquake technology.
Within minutes of the quake, a huge tsunami is detected racing towards Japan's northern shoreline. What follows will leave the world reeling.
Absolute destruction, not a building left standing.
The 2011 Japanese quake and tsunami is the costliest natural disaster of all time, and the reason why coastal engineer Alison Raby puts it in the top 10.
Japan has a long history of being hit by big waves. In fact, the word tsunami is Japanese for harbour wave. And it's this history that has led to Japan having the most sophisticated protection systems on the planet.
Japan sits at the junction of 4 major tectonic plates. It's why the area is so geologically volatile, and why the Japanese are so well prepared to deal with the threat. So what went wrong in 2011? The problems begin on March the 11th. Earthquake detection systems predict a huge tremor with a magnitude of 7.2. Warnings are sent out. Chris Alderson has lived in Japan for 13 years. He's come to expect such tremors as an everyday part of life.
Earthquakes are sufficiently common that people don't usually concern themselves with them overly. Some of them are so minor they barely even stir comment. Others, people will perk up their ears a little bit, point out the earthquake to their co-workers and get back to their work.
At 2:46 p.m. local time, the earthquake hits. With a magnitude of 9, it's 100 times more powerful than predicted.
You tend to expect them to fade away as usual. Instead, they sort of grew in strength and intensity to an extent that none of us had experienced before.
It's the largest known quake in Japanese history. One of the 5 most powerful ever recorded. The quake's epicenter is 65 kilometers off Japan's east coast, where a 300-kilometer section of the Earth's crust has pushed upwards by about 5 meters. It's a seismic event known as an undersea megathrust earthquake. The force of the shockwaves is so enormous, Japan moves 2.5 meters, and the axis of the entire planet shifts about 18 centimeters. Despite the magnitude of the quake, precautionary measures limit the damage.
There's a great deal of education among the Japanese population about how to behave during such disasters. So whilst there was concern, there wasn't the sort of terrified panic which one might suspect.
It appears technology has protected the Japanese. But the earthquake is just the first phase of a double disaster they're to face that day. Because the tremor has given birth to a tsunami, and it's heading towards Japan's northern coastline. Coastal engineer Alison Raby has been studying why the events of 2011 escalated into one of the worst disasters of its kind, placing it in the top 10.
We're going to simulate that megathrust type event using this hinged board down here. That's going to represent the edge of the crust that comes up in that type of rupture, and we're going to spring that plate up, and that's going to raise a huge body of water. 3, 2, 1.
In open water, the initial wave is relatively small, just 1 meter high. But as it approaches the shoreline and enters the shallows, it begins to slow and grow in height. all too aware earthquakes can cause huge waves, Japan has a sophisticated tsunami warning system.
In Japan, when there is a tsunami, warnings are automatically generated, which are heard on cell phones, brought onto television stations. Immediately, people were aware that something was going on.
Along Japan's northeast coastline, people begin to evacuate or take refuge in designated shelters.
Japan had one of the best defended coastlines in the whole world. And here we recreated certain parts of the Japanese coastline.
Raby and her team have reconstructed particular towns and their defences to examine how they coped when the tsunami hit.
We start here in the city of Kamaishi. Kamaishi was a deep water port and it had the world's deepest breakwater. This was protecting the very large steel factory and a large population. Further south, we had the settlement of Minami Sanriku, and here we've recreated one of the vertical evacuation structures. This was clearly signed so that people who were on low ground could escape from the incoming wave. And then we move into the coastal plains. Now these were protected by concrete revetments, and behind that a pine forest, and those were all designed to protect the settlements behind.
The Japanese have taken a calculated risk. Their fortifications are only designed to cope with waves up to 12 meters high. But the tsunami surging towards them is a monster, peaking at 40 meters. In Tokyo, Chris Alderson is stunned by what he sees.
As we watched images on the screen of hundreds of thousands of people losing their homes and being hauled from their day-to-day humdrum lives, it was something none of us could comprehend at first.
Alison Raby recreates the tsunami in miniature. By comparing footage from each of the towns hit by the tsunami to the model recreations, a demo can help understand why the best defenses on the planet failed so catastrophically. Not only did the trees do little to stop the wave, the shattered stumps added to the debris flow, making the tsunami even more lethal. The shelter in Minami Sanriku remained intact, but many similar shelters were too close to the shore, with over 100 ending up underwater. And after the tsunami passed, the state-of-the-art Kamaishi breakwater wall lay in pieces. To help the victims, Chris Alderson heads north to the flood zone.
We went from the humdrum day-to-day life in the big city to suddenly traveling through what appeared like a set from a science fiction post-Holocaust movie. To suddenly see these people torn from their homes, to see the scale of this destruction and death, where a boat is dropped in the middle of a village, or a large articulated truck is stranded on the roof of a factory. It was unworldly. It was very difficult to believe that this was a new reality.
The disaster gets even worse when a flooded reactor at the Fukushima Daiichi plant melts down.
Initially, reports were unreliable. We were not certain to what extent the radiation had spread and whether or not the situation was about to get worse or was going to come under control.
Thanks to the courage of the reactor workers, the situation is brought under control. The tsunami leaves over $200 billion worth of damage in its wake, making it the costliest natural disaster ever.
The scale of destruction was almost absolute. There were no people in the ruins that we could see other than military workers putting flags on human remains, marking cars with X's after they checked them to see if bodies were included. The smell of the decomposition of what had been washed out of the oceans, human remains, fish hung heavy in the air, and it was an experience I think nothing can prepare you for.
For Alison Raby, it's not just the cost, but also the way the tsunami exposed the frailty of our most sophisticated protection systems that elevates this disaster into the top 10.
Japan was supposedly the best prepared nation on Earth to survive a mega tsunami, and yet even they underestimated the power of the wave. And for that reason, I believe that this event is one of the world's worst natural disasters.
(1918). A viral disease known as the Spanish flu is spreading around the globe like wildfire. Decimating every country it touches, the virus kills an estimated 30 million people in less than 6 months. And 100 years on, its deadly descendants are now one of the biggest threats we face.
The CDC is working to develop a vaccine.
We are closely monitoring the emerging cases of swine flu in the United States.
The speed with which the Spanish flu killed millions is why virologist Dr. Mike Leahy nominates it as one of the top 10 natural disasters.
By 1918, the First World War was drawing to an end. For the last 4 years, the world had been locked in conflict centred on the battlefields of Europe, with around 9 million soldiers losing their lives. But the fighters of the front line were about, with some dying within the first 24 hours.
Even battle-hardened medics were horrified by the gruesome way the men died.
The lungs of many victims were so full of fluid, they were compared by pathologists to the lungs of the drowned. It was the start of a pandemic that would affect almost every country in the world and leave tens of millions dead.
In the warring countries, news about the outbreak was limited. But the disease was heavily reported in neutral Spain, earning it the name Spanish flu. Leahy believes the conditions in the trenches could provide clues to the source of the outbreak.
The emergence of new viral diseases can often be triggered by close associations between large numbers of people and animals, such as pigs.
When humans become infected with an animal flu virus, an entirely new strain of influenza can be created.
Hence the name of outbreaks such as swine flu or bird flu. So it's not difficult to imagine that during the First World War, when large numbers of soldiers were barracked right next door to animals, often in the presence of gases that could possibly be mutagenic, a new virus could surface.
With the men crammed together, the disease tears through the ranks. In the US Army, as many as 1 million men contract the virus. But the epidemic in the trenches is only the beginning. On the 11th of November 1918, peace is declared. Returning troops unwittingly spread the disease across the globe, escalating it into a pandemic. Mass celebrations accelerate the transmission, and up to 1 billion people, half the world's population at the time, become infected.
One of the most frightening aspects of the 1918 epidemic was the way it struck people down in their prime. The death rate among 15 to 34-year-olds was around 20 times higher than that of other flus. Why was Spanish flu so deadly to those who should have been the fittest?
Breakthroughs in understanding how the virus attacks our body may provide the answer.
The key thing about Spanish flu and other severe pandemics is that the immune system attacks the lining of the lung, and that causes liquids and fluids to start to seep in. People effectively start to drown in their own fluids. It must have been horrific to experience and actually horrific to observe as well. There's lots of descriptions in the medical literature at the time of these patients slowly turning blue, and when nurses and doctors saw that, they knew it was their end.
And this wasn't something that was unique to weaker or old people, quite the opposite.
Absolutely. In fact, the fact they were young and healthy probably contributed to it, because what caused the damage to the lungs is part of the immune system, and it's called a cytokine cascade. So the immune system started to damage the lungs, and that's what allowed the liquids and the fluids to get in there and for people to actually drown.
The viral descendants of Spanish flu are still claiming lives in the 21st century. 2009, the H1N1 swine flu kills up to 500,000 people, causing the World Health Organization to raise the pandemic alert to the high.
In 12 months, Spanish flu claimed the lives of between 20 and 100 million people. Potentially, that's 10 times the number of soldiers who died during the 4 years of World War I. In the US, the epidemic reduced average lifespan by 10 years. And it's these horrific statistics that place Spanish flu firmly in our list of natural disasters.
In the summer of 1883, the Indonesian volcano Krakatoa is becoming increasingly restless. It'll soon blow itself out of the water in a horrific spectacle that will guarantee its iconic status. Professor Nick Petford votes this first globally reported disaster into the top 10 because of the dramatic way it led to the birth of volcanology. Petford travels to where the legendary Krakatoa once stood. Anak Krakatau is one of the most volcanically active places on the planet. Here, one vast tectonic plate is being pushed below another, allowing super-hot lava to surge to the surface. Since the 1950s, the volcano has grown in height by an average of 4 meters a year.
Anak Krakatau is a classic cone-shaped volcano with one peak. But in 1883, the Krakatoa volcano comprised 3 separate peaks. And what people thought was that meant it was 3 small volcanoes. Well, that was a big mistake, because underlying those volcanoes was one single magma chamber. And when it blew, the amount of energy that was released in the eruption was enough to blow the entire island apart.
At the time, there were hundreds of Europeans living in the area, trading the spices that flourished on the fertile volcanic soils.
But there was one Dutch expat in particular, a man called Roger Verbeek, a geologist. Verbeek spent the summer before the eruption of 1883 surveying the islands.
Verbeek's report would play a crucial role in establishing Krakatoa's lasting legacy. Sunday, August the 26th, 1883. The morning calm is shattered by one massive explosion after another. Clues to what the 1883 eruption would have been like can be seen on Anak Krakatau, which is littered with huge lava bombs.
Now, this is a big piece. It's about the size of a car, and around me here there are 2 or 3 similar sized bombs. But in 1883, when Krakatoa was in full eruption, the sky would have been full of hundreds of these sorts of bombs, flying not just hundreds of yards, but perhaps tens of miles. Literally a rain of fire falling from above.
By 2 p.m., a black cloud 3 times the height of Mount Everest surges up from the volcano.
In the immediate aftermath of the 1883 eruption, we know from eyewitness reports that the skies darkened, day turned into night. And that was because so much ash and dust was thrown up into the atmosphere. But the effects were felt farther away than just Indonesia. People talk of strange sunsets with vivid colours in London, in Paris, in New York. And all of those things were due to the volcanic eruption in 1883.
27th of August, 5 a.m. 4 monstrous eruptions rip through the volcano. The force of the blast is 13,000 times that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The sound generated is the loudest in recorded history. The explosive eruptions throw out billions of tons of pulverized rock, scalding hot ash, and gas that accelerate down and away from the volcano. It's been calculated these pyroclastic flows have enough power to climb over 830 meters, twice as tall as the Empire State Building.
Now, you might expect a pyroclastic flow when it hits the sea to stop because of the water, but that's not the case. Sometimes a pyroclastic flow, if it's strong enough and hot enough, it can hit the sea and keep on travelling. Steam forms around the front of the flow and protects it from the water. And we know this was the case in the 1883 eruption, because on that morning, villagers in a town called Ketimbang gathered to watch the spectacle.
Within minutes, the super-fast, super-hot debris crosses the 40 kilometers of water towards the residents of Ketimbang.
Probably the last thing that they ever saw was a pyroclastic flow emerging from the waves. And you don't want to get caught in one of these flows because you're simultaneously burnt, suffocated and pummeled to death by the rock.
Around 1,000 of Ketimbang's residents die instantly. And the disaster isn't finished yet. During Krakatoa's final death throes, the volcano collapses into the ocean. The splash triggers a tsunami of epic proportions, traveling at 320 kilometers per hour. In its path is the small Javanese settlement of Anya. On the west coast of Java, a Dutch lighthouse, very similar to the one that stands here today, towers above the surrounding buildings. It's constructed to cope with the worst that the weather can throw at it. Even though the tsunami is heading their way, the keeper and his family choose to stay to ensure the lighthouse remains operational.
So in a building like this, made from reinforced steel, they must have felt safe, even from the most powerful of waves.
But adding to the power of the wave are huge chunks of rock torn from the seabed.
When the wave struck, it was 40 meters high. That's about 130 feet, nearly as high as I am here now. The wave ripped up from the sea floor great big lumps of coral and slammed them against the side of the lighthouse. And despite being reinforced with an iron girder, the lighthouse collapsed.
These bricks are all that remain of the ill-fated lighthouse. Miraculously, the lighthouse keeper survived, but his wife and child perished in the water, along with tens of thousands of others. It's the most destructive tsunami created by a volcano in history. As the sun sets on the 27th of August 1883, Krakatoa is no more. The volcano has blown itself out of existence.
As well as being a spectacular volcanic eruption, Krakatoa is important for other reasons. Just before the eruption, undersea telegraph cables had been laid between Jakarta and the rest of the world. So as the eruption unfolded, people could follow it in real time, the same way that we would do today using the internet. So in that sense, Krakatoa became the world's first globally reported disaster story.
The Dutch geologist Roger Verbeek also played a critical role in raising Krakatoa to its iconic status.
And after the eruption, his report was so insightful that it laid the foundations for an entire new science, volcanology. And it's for these reasons that Krakatoa is one of the top 10 natural disasters of all time.
On August the 24th, 2005, a tropical storm forms over the Bahamas. 5 days later, it will leave the city of New Orleans in ruins.
Everything was gone within a flickering of an eye.
A chain of natural events and human error will conspire to make Katrina the world's most expensive hurricane.
It's just all gone.
It's for these reasons meteorologist Tim Marshall thinks this disaster should be in the top 10.
New Orleans is a city surrounded by water. 300 years ago, it was just a small settlement on the bank of the Mississippi River, high above sea level. But over time, it's expanded out into marshlands, and people now live below sea level in much of New Orleans.
Known as a storm surge. Many hurricane deaths are the result of drowning. On the 24th of August 2005, the National Hurricane Center is tracking the tropical storm that will become Katrina.
Katrina first formed, it was nothing really unusual. It was pretty much like any other tropical system at that point.
The storm soon intensifies to a Category 1 hurricane.
So our demeanor at that point was to treat it like a normal hurricane that we've seen many times before.
Like all hurricanes, Katrina forms as rising warm air from the sea creates strong winds and thick clouds full of moisture. Fueled by the unusually warm seas of the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina quickly grows into a much bigger and more powerful hurricane. Back at the Weather Center, Katrina looms large on the screens.
The satellite imagery revealed a huge eye. It became apparent that we were dealing with a Category 5 hurricane at this point.
The data shows Katrina will strike New Orleans in less than 24 hours.
We had to start issuing our watches and warnings and statements.
Every person is hereby ordered to immediately evacuate.
Those that can get out of town. 1 million people flee the city. But many people simply can't afford to leave. Stanley and Betty Stewart live in the lower 9th Ward.
The decision was made that we weren't going to be able to go anywhere under the financial conditions, and we elect to just stay and pray and hope for the best.
So it ended up being 13 of us in the 2 rooms, basically. All of us know we hunker down.
Up to 100,000 people are left behind to face whatever nature has to throw at them.
We padded our back door with some towels to just keep the water from actually seeping under.
With a long history of hurricane strikes, New Orleans is surrounded by 560 kilometers of protective levees.
A levee is just made of combinations of clay and sand. The big problem came with all these miles of levee, that some levees were high and some levees were low, some were sinking.
Worse still, the levees were not built to withstand a hurricane of Katrina's intensity. The 29th of August, 6:10 a.m. Hurricane Katrina strikes land, with wind speeds of 210 kilometers per hour. With waves up to 8 meters high, the largest storm surge in American history pummels the Gulf Coast. New Orleans is inundated with water.
You can actually hear the waves coming over the roof of the home.
Those stranded have little idea what to do.
Don't panic. Keep these children down.
My brother, looked at me. I said, man, we just really need to pray. I say, because visually it actually looked like it was going to be your last day on earth.
2 p.m. and the residents of the lower 9th Ward are in serious trouble.
We got major flooding here. Lots of problems here, lots of problems.
Some people were actually by that time in 20 feet of water. Some of our friends that were in homes, they had loss of life.
The 30th of August. The hurricane has blown itself out. All the main communication lines are down.
Just trying to figure out, are we the only people left, or is there anybody else around?
With most of New Orleans underwater, the emergency services are left floundering.
They finally said on the radio, you've got to realize that the levee on the 17th Street Canal broke and there's water to the roofs of the houses in Lakeview. I can tell you my life changed right at that point. Everybody didn't realize that this was a new ball game now, that now the city was flooding.
Chris and his colleagues face a disaster of epic proportions.
Everywhere you went, you saw bodies floating. They didn't have enough coroners to come pick up the bodies.
The survivors are corralled into the New Orleans Superdome and Convention Center.
The conditions that was at the convention center was unbearable. People were thinking that they were going to go to a lit shelter where maybe there would have been food or clothing or water. It was nothing. And people were literally just abandoned out on the streets.
With over 46,000 people, some are left with little option but to fend for themselves.
People were dying for lack of resources. We were like, oh my goodness, is this the end of the earth? Is this the end of life?
The failure by the authorities to deal with the rescue and evacuation of so many compounds the disaster.
The big thing that caught people off guard was the flood waters. Nobody expected 80% of the city to be underwater.
Almost a decade later, 1 in 5 of the population still hasn't returned. And large sections of the city lie in ruins.
I'm currently driving through the lower 9th Ward here, one of the areas that was hardest hit from Hurricane Katrina. And most of the houses here, people didn't come back to. They just abandoned them or just left them here to rot. And it's sort of sad because our neighborhood is gone. It's going to take a generation or more to rebuild this area.
2 weeks after Katrina swamped New Orleans, President George Bush apologizes for the administration's failure to deal with the aftermath.
Katrina exposed serious problems in our response capability at all levels of government. And to the extent that the federal government didn't fully do its job right, I take responsibility.
The impact of human error is why Tim Marshall places this disaster in the top 10.
Certainly, Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster, but that natural disaster was compounded by the effects of man. The fact that Katrina happened was a wake-up call. Now, the levees are built a little higher, maybe a little stronger. But this disaster can happen. In fact, it will happen again.
This is how the Earth looked at the end of the last ice age. The northern hemisphere covered in ice. Europe barely recognizable. But evidence suggests the world map is about to be redrawn by a mega flood of biblical proportions. Oceanographer Simon Boxall is fascinated by the idea of a planet-changing flood and has nominated it for the top 10. As it melts, a vast freshwater lake bigger than Texas forms. For a time, the water is contained behind a wall of ice. But 8,500 years ago, this ice gives way, releasing this colossal body of water into the world's oceans.
This had a dramatic impact on the already rising sea levels, adding a further 1 to 2 meters, that's 3 to 6 feet, in a very short period of time. And if that was to happen today with the same speed, it would completely devastate London, New York. In fact, it would impact on every coastal nation around the world.
And in the ancient world, the rising waters spreading across the planet could have also led to disaster. Because according to some studies, the area now covered by the Black Sea was once home to one of the largest populations of the time.
9,000 years ago, this would have been an enormous valley leading down to this huge freshwater lake. It would have been filled with settlements, farmlands, a population of over 100,000 people. But that all changed when the floodwaters hit.
Swollen by the mega flood, water from the Mediterranean begins to pour into the region, transforming the once fertile land into a saltwater sea. Simon Boxall meets Konstantin Cherev, who in 2011 took part in a survey of the Black Sea that produced an astonishing find.
When we scanned the seabed, we found a formation that's really unusual. It was sort of a round hill, and that's not very common for the Black Sea. So we decided to send a probe and take a sample of it.
As they carefully inspected the core sample, the scientists made an unexpected discovery. Tiny pieces of wood.
This is the top. When we analyzed the wood and carbon dated it, we found that it's 9,000 years old, and that's amazing.
Where do you think it came from?
The most exciting scenario is that this underwater hill is actually an ancient human settlement, because as a shape and size and height, it exactly matches the settlements on the ground we found all over Eastern Europe.
Cherev is certain an area that's now under 90 meters of water was once dry land.
Absolutely. I'm 100% positive about it.
To find out more about the people that were living in the region hit by the flood, Simon Boxall has been given rare access to examine an incredible archaeological find. Unearthed from a nearby burial site dating back over 6,000 years were over 200 skeletons, along with a spectacular treasure trove of gold. Expert Christo Smolenov believes this precisely made jewelry is proof of a surprisingly advanced civilization.
For instance, those are two separate gold objects, quite different, and still they fit perfectly And this is more than you can expect from a culture 7,000 years old. It is a superculture.
It's amazing how precise their measurements were in a culture that is so ancient.
Christo has little doubt this superculture was living right in the megaflood's path. And he believes the exodus of these people played a crucial role in the development of Western civilization.
I think the migration of this superculture that followed some of the catastrophic events that took place here is responsible for the migration of knowledge as well.
If Smolonov is correct, it is possible that the scattering of this ancient population may have sowed the seeds from which the Egyptian and Greek cultures eventually grew 2,000 years later. Simon Boxall is also convinced of the profound effect this mega flood had on humanity.
This flood drove apart a burgeoning civilization, possibly one of the earliest we know. And yet, this flood could have been the catalyst that led to our modern civilization. And it's for this reason that I believe that this ancient flood deserves its place amongst the world's top 10 natural disasters.
(1906). San Francisco is the biggest and most powerful city on America's west coast. But what none of its inhabitants know is they're living over a ticking time bomb. That's all about to change when a massive quake strikes. Seismologist Thomas Jordan has selected this earth-shattering event for the top 10 because of the way it helped unlock the inner secrets of our planet and revolutionized our understanding of how we can protect ourselves from these deadly forces. Tsunamis that obliterate our best defense systems.
The scale of destruction was almost absolute.
Volcanoes that kill millions.
You don't want to get caught in one of these flows because you're simultaneously burnt, suffocated and pummeled to death.
Earthquakes that expose the planet's inner secrets and diseases that push humanity towards extinction.
The travel doctor took one look and said, "You have the bubonic plague."
But which catastrophes have had the biggest impact? We're going to reveal the top 10 ultimate natural disasters that have changed the world. A natural disaster. The moment a force of nature collides with humanity, with tragic results. Now, together with some of the world's leading experts, we've put together a list of the 10 most devastating disasters ever.
2, 1.
Disasters are rated by their magnitude, their lasting legacy, death toll, and the economic cost of the damage they caused. First on our list is the deadly 2011 tornado season that meteorologist Karen Kosiba firmly places in the top 10. Spring in Middle America.
We have a tornado on the ground, Ashtola, Texas.
A time when a vast swathe of land from Texas to the Canadian prairies is transformed into Tornado Alley.
Don't even stop, let's go! Go! Get the hell out of here!
This part of the world is used to twisters, but the 2011 outbreak stands out.
Holy cow!
We could actually hear the house coming apart. The wood, the walls. My wife had to grab a hold of some of the plumbing pipes because she was being sucked towards the stairwell.
Look at that! Destruction!
I've been collecting data on tornadoes for over 7 years now, and I haven't seen anything like the 2011 tornado season.
Weather experts like Karen are only just beginning to piece together how a tornado forms.
We do know the ingredients that are necessary to come together in order to form the storms that spawn tornadoes. In particular, there are 3 ingredients that we need. First of all, we need a very unstable air mass. Also, we need wind shear, so we need a lot of turning of winds with height in the atmosphere. And then thirdly, we need some sort of trigger, some sort of impetus to get these storms started.
In 2011, all 3 factors come together to create the perfect tornado breeding ground. By early April, a massive weather system forms over southeastern USA, spawning an outbreak of twisters.
Only a small percentage of them were violent, but there were a lot of them.
With winds in excess of 320 kilometers per hour, the energy released is equivalent to that of a 10-ton bomb detonating.
Hello? Hello? Oh, give her, sweetie. Give her, honey.
The house now was gone. The kitchen was totally gone. And there were parts of other people's houses in our kitchen. And one by one, you'd see these piles of rubbles where an arm would poke through or a leg would poke through. Most of the family broke down and started to cry.
Leaving 158 people dead, the Joplin tornado is the deadliest since modern records began. And with over $2.8 billion worth of damage, it's also the costliest. The 758 twisters in April are the greatest number ever seen in 1 month. It's for these reasons Karen Kasiba rates the 2011 tornado season as one of the top 10 natural disasters.
Not only do we have a lot of tornadoes, especially in the months of April and May, but we also had tornadoes hitting populated areas. And not just any type of tornado, so the highest possible wind speeds that could be associated with tornadoes. Those factors in particular are what made that season so devastating.
March 2011. A massive earthquake rocks the world on its axis. The epicenter, 65 kilometers off the coast of Japan.
In Japan, we get earth tremors every few weeks. There's amazing earthquake technology.
Within minutes of the quake, a huge tsunami hits Tim Bartow and his family find cover.
As I was going around the corner to go down the basement, the corner of the kitchen was coming apart. You could hear the sound coming. It was like these, people say it sounds like a locomotive, and it sounds like a dozen. There was debris and chunks of mud and sludge and rain and glass and rocks and bricks and everything blowing in through that door and all around us. And it was at that time that I realized the tornado was right on top of us. We could actually hear the house coming apart. And I thought, there's nothing between us and the vortex of this tornado except 1-inch piece of wood that we have in the floor. And of course, the rest of the family, they were crying and they were just hysterical.
I love everyone. I love everyone, man. Yeah, I love all you guys.
intense updrafts near the surface, wafting all different sorts of debris, lifting houses and cars, creating a very dangerous, dark, and volatile environment. Tornadoes really are one of the most devastating forces in nature on the planet.
The carnage caused by a direct hit from an EF5 tornado is all too real for the residents of Joplin, Missouri.
The south side of Joplin's just been leveled. Houses are gone. People are thrown, injured. I know we're going to have casualties. It's like a down forward. It's gone. It's gone.
And at that point, I didn't know how bad it was, but I knew we had survived a direct hit.
Unbelievable. Look at the houses.
That's when I got my first look at what had happened.
Unfortunately, in 2011, the violent tornadoes were impacting larger cities, and that's where we ran into our issues with people being unfortunately killed and injured.
April the 25th. The start of a series of storms that'll generate 343 tornadoes in less than a week, killing 321 people. It's one of the deadliest outbreaks in U.S. history.
Jumbo outbreak of tornadoes, which is probably the worst kind to get.
On April the 27th, a ferocious tornado batters Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
This is a large, violent tornado coming up on downtown Tuscaloosa. Be in a safe place right now.
Wind speeds approaching 300 kilometers per hour leave 65 people dead.
The destruction was, in some cases, total and complete.
After the horrific events of April 2011, the start of May is eerily quiet. Until May the 22nd, a massive tornado takes shape. In its path is Joplin, Missouri.
My daughter came rushing out of her bedroom and said, you know, my friend's mom called. She said, there's a tornado coming. We need to get her home.
Joplin resident Tim Bartow grew up in Tornado Alley. But even he's caught out by the storm's ferocity.
Within a matter of a couple minutes, sirens actually started to go off.
Cover on the ground right here. Right, get the sirens going. Get the sirens going. I'm telling you.
The tornado carves a path through Joplin's southwestern suburbs. With just seconds to spare,